I want to ask a lot of lessons learned and philosophical questions, but before I do that, I do want to get your take on some of the news items of the day. First of all, there are a whole bunch of tweets that President Trump has done in the last few hours about the border and specifically about this caravan. One of them I'll just read. Sadly, it looks like Mexico's police and military are unable to stop the caravan heading to the southern border of the United States. Criminals and unknown Middle Easterners are mixed in. I have alerted Border Patrol and military that this is a national, and then a word that presumably is emergency. It's emergy, but presumably he meant emergency. Must change laws, exclamation point. It goes on from there. You're from a border state. Right. You're from a state where undocumented immigrants and the issue of illegal immigration is not just theoretical. Right. What's your take on the tweet and on how President Trump is obviously trying to use this issue for the midterms? Well,
I've had an issue with the way the president has used immigration for quite a while. This first trip down the escalator, right after that, is when he talked about Mexican rapists, and I thought that was just beyond the pale. And so his approach to this issue is not helpful. We obviously need better border security. We've been doing that over the past several years. We're at really record lows in terms of crossings into Arizona and Texas and the whole southern border, largely because Mexico, the economy has done well, largely because of free trade agreements like NAFTA. That's good. We ought to celebrate that. We have a net flow of migrants south with regard to Mexico, but still countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, with economies that are hurting and violence, still send people. And, or people go, and not sent by their governments. But one thing that the president has talked about, cutting foreign aid to those countries. We have very little foreign aid going, and that aid that we do have helps them with law enforcement, drug interdiction, and programs to help that population stay there. And cutting those programs indiscriminately, those benefit us as well. And so that needs to be thoughtfully done, the way we approach this issue.
Do you have any idea what the president's talking about when he says there are unknown Middle Easterners mixed in with the caravan?
That's long been pretty much a canard and a fear tactic. Obviously, with a border that large, you're going to have people come across that are coming from other countries, and some obviously with nefarious motives. But to make it sound like this is in order to put people in here who would do us harm, and to emphasize the criminals among them, it's just I just don't think that it's the right way to approach it. These, for the most part, overwhelmingly are people who are either fleeing violence or looking for a better life. And we have programs for some of them, asylum programs, and others. Obviously, we can't accept everyone. We have to have border security, but it needs to be done in a thoughtful manner.
The fact checkers can't keep up with the president these days. He's saying so many things that aren't true or have no evidence behind them. The Middle Easterners mixed in with the caravan. Right. Last week he said the Trump administration passed an opioids bill with little Democratic support. Right. As you know, the vote was 98 to 1, and that one was a Republican. He said that people are rioting in California over sanctuary cities. There's no evidence of anybody rioting. We only have 25 minutes, so I have to stop there. But what do you make of this? Like, the president constantly says things that are just not true. Mm-hmm. They're lies. And it's difficult to understand why he keeps doing it, just on a political level or a psychological level.
Well, sometimes because it works. And you wonder if you see a rally or a speech, and he's had a lot of rallies lately in Arizona and elsewhere, and when you hear him say some of the things he says, and to me now, it's just gone so far beyond, expecting the president to pivot anymore. But what is troubling is to look behind him and see the reaction of people to what he says. And that's what's troubling. The lock her up chants, talking about not just Hillary Clinton, but Dianne Feinstein or Dr. Ford or others. That's just unseemly. And that's what's more troubling to me now is who believes this? And he does it, I think, because it still works. It still riles people up. It divides us horribly to talk about the opioid thing. And talk back to immigration when he's saying that Democrats just want open borders. I was on the Gang of Eight. I was there with Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin and Bob Menendez and Michael Bennet. We agreed in that legislation to $41 billion in border security measures. Technology, increased barriers, fences, walls, whatever made sense along the border, manpower, $41 billion worth. And the Democrats agreed to that. Every Democrat in the Senate voted for that bill. We had 68 votes. It passed 68 to 32. That is not a party that wants open borders. You may have a few here or there, but to label the entire Democratic Party as wanting open borders is just not truthful. But it works out there. It riles up the base. And I think that he'll do it as long as some people believe it. And that, gratefully, the media calls him on some of it, but he still does it.
There aren't that many people in your party who call him on it. You're one, Ben Sasse to a lesser degree is one, Senator John McCain, may he rest in peace, was one. But I have to say, I've been really stunned at the lack of voices joining yours in just standing up for truth and decency when it comes to these issues. I know you get heat from the resistance for they expect you to not only condemn President Trump but then also to support Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill, which isn't what's going to happen. But just in terms of how lonely it must be to be Jeff Flake, is it? It looks it from where I sit.
There are times. No, there are some others who speak up, but a lot of it is fatigue.
Who else is speaking up?
Ben, certainly, and Senator McCain did, and a few others on certain topics. I wish that people would speak up more. You can't, if we were asked and if we answered every call to condemn every tweet, that
right.
takes all the time, and you can't expect that. But when the president does something big, when he applauds somebody for beating up a journalist, for being actually convicted or pleading guilty to assault on a journalist and celebrating that, that's something that we ought to speak up on. Say, no, that's not right. That doesn't represent our party. That doesn't represent us as Americans. That's just not right. When he continually refers to the press as, the enemy of the people, that phrase has a very ignoble pedigree. And it matters around the world with a record number of journalists detained and murdered this year.
Do you see a line from President Trump using that rhetoric to Turkey locking up more journalists than anywhere else in the world, to what happened possibly even to Khashoggi? You can't prove it, but do you think that that rhetoric has convinced autocrats and dictators, I can do whatever I want to journalists?
Well, you hear autocrats and dictators talking about fake news. Bashar Assad in Syria saying, when criticism came of his detaining, his own people of the opposition and what happened in those prisons, he said, that's fake news. That's what we call it now, isn't it? When the president stands next to Duterte of the Philippines, and Duterte refers to journalists as spies, and the president is laughing along with him, that makes a difference. That matters. And we shouldn't, as senators and as members of Congress, we shouldn't be sanguine about the effect of words. And some people will say, well, you members of Congress, you'll give a speech or you'll speak out. But if you don't speak out, they'll say, why didn't you speak out? When you do speak out, well, you've got to go further. You voted against Gina Haspel, you should have voted against Kavanaugh. Or you'd voted against the president's immigration plan, you should vote against this or that. I think that it's our responsibility to follow, our conscience. I've tried to do that. And our philosophy. I'm a conservative. I like conservative policy. There are some things that the Congress has done that the president has supported that I like. Some things that the president has done that I voted against or that I dislike. But when the president goes so far on certain things that are so antithetical to American values, it's our responsibility, particularly as Republicans, as members of his party, to speak up.
I want to get to your experience in the Senate, but before I do want to ask just your take on how President Trump has been handling the situation when it comes to the Saudis and the murder of Khashoggi. I interviewed Bob Corker yesterday, and he seemed to, well, first of all, he said that he thinks the Crown Prince is behind it, and that the U.S. needs to think about its policy going forward. And he seems to think that President Trump is getting to the right place on this issue if he hasn't been. What's your take?
I agree with Bob Corker. I think it's difficult to fathom that the Crown Prince didn't know what was going on there. And the more that comes out, the more it points right in that direction. And the explanations that have to be re-explained and a new story just doesn't hold water. So I do think the president, it sounds like he's coming around to that. He doesn't want to. Of course, none of us want to. You want, if you have an ally that you work with on certain things, you don't want to disrupt that relationship. But we have to have some values. And speaking out against a regime, if they murdered a journalist, that ought to be an easy call. That's a layup. And I hope the president is coming that direction, because the other explanations of what happened just don't hold water.
You're going to be leaving office in really just a few weeks. What was your best moment in the U.S. Senate?
There have been a lot of good ones. I'm not leaving the Senate because I dislike the institution or the people. I love all of them. It's a great institution, a great system of government. And it is so good that it withstands the foibles of those like me who go through the place. And we'll be okay. But probably the best moment, if I could pick one, was I've always had this crazy notion that we ought to allow Americans to travel wherever they want to unless there's a compelling national security reason not to. And that includes Cuba. And so I've, for the past 18 years, have been trying to allow Americans to travel freely to Cuba, just like they can anywhere else. And that policy, I was able to pass legislation a few times in the early Bush years and couldn't get President Bush to sign it. And then when President Obama would have signed it, I couldn't pass it anymore. But we were at a point where we could have done that policy, but Cuba was holding an American prisoner by the name of Alan Gross. And I'd been down to see him along with Tom Udall from New Mexico in prison in Havana, and he was not doing well. And I came back, and the administration had been negotiating for his release, and the president asked if I would go down along with Pat Leahy, who I'd been working on this issue with, and do an old-fashioned Cold War era spy swap, prisoner swap. Alan Gross, a couple of Cubans who had been held in American prisons, and another Cuban national who was a spy for us years ago, held in a Cuban prison. 3 planes landing all at once in Havana and then taking off. We brought Alan Gross, the American, back. And I'll never forget, the best moment was we were in the air for about half an hour, and the pilot came on and said, "We've now entered U.S. airspace." And Alan Gross and his wife was there too. Alan just stood up and shook his fist in the air and just breathed in and out deeply several times and said, "Now I know I'm free." And it was just a moment I'll never forget. That's tough to top, that one. And my wife and I were on a flight the other day to Dallas, and Alan Gross and his wife Judy were on the flight, and we
coincidentally,
just coincidentally, and but Alan sends me a card every December 17th, and it's just something I'll always remember.
That's a great moment. What was your worst moment in the Senate?
Probably the worst 8 minutes was on the baseball field. I was a Republican, well, go back a bit, when Gabby Giffords was shot. It was just a horrible, horrible time. And then a few years later to be on that baseball field practicing with the other Republicans and hearing the shots ring out. And I'll never forget turning toward the dugout as somebody yelled, "Shooter, shooter," and we saw Steve Scalise go down at second base. I was between home and first base, and I ran toward the dugout, and I saw the bullets pitching off the gravel in front of me. But there was no other place to go. And I just remember thinking at that time, why us? Why? You know, how could somebody look at a bunch of middle-aged men playing baseball and see the enemy? And that was just a horrible, horrible moment. And that's what sticks with me, you know, more than anything. And then obviously going out to Steve and trying to plug up the wound with a baseball glove, and then having to call his wife afterwards. And
you called his wife?
Yeah, to try to get to her before she heard, and I did. And that was the toughest time. That was the toughest. Fortunately, he survived. He's doing well.
He almost didn't.
Almost
a couple times it was touch and go there.
Yeah, it was. But I thought, you know, at the hospital that night, you know, waiting for the doctors to come in to say if he was going to make it or not. It was, you know, just not that long before the hospital in Tucson, waiting to see if Gabby Giffords would pull through. And then fast forward to today, I'll be on a call in about an hour with some U.S. attorneys who are deciding where to arraign somebody who's been indicted for death threats against me and my family. And those are coming on, that one is from the right, but there are some on the left as well. So it's a different place, and we've got to do better. We have to tone down the rhetoric. We have to be in a better place in the future than we are right now.
I'm going to ask you a similar pair of questions, and the only reason I'm telling you this is because the first one I'm going to ask you to say something, and I know it's not your tendency to be immodest, but I'm going to ask you to be immodest, and that will be followed by a question about what was your most embarrassing moment, or the moment that you regret the most. But first, I'd like to know. Obviously, the Alan Gross was your best. Was a wonderful moment, your best moment in the Senate. What are you proudest of, though? Maybe it's that, I don't know. But what are you proudest of in terms of accomplishment, in terms of anything?
Proudest of probably in the House. I spent 12 years in the House, and we'd been earmarking like crazy. I grew up on a farm and a ranch, and earmarking is what you did to the calf's left ear as part of the brand. You know, that was an earmark to say that calf is yours. And earmark in Congress was something that says that pot of funding is mine. And it had become just a horribly corrupt practice where every member of Congress was basically entitled to a certain amount of money for the home folks, or to businesses, or to friends. We had two of my colleagues in jail, Duke Cunningham and Bob Ney, because of the practice. And I'd gone to the floor in the House, you talk about lonely, several hundred times to try to remove individual spending items, challenge Speaker Hastert, one of his earmarks, and others several hundred times, and I won one vote, one out of several hundred. But soon members started to beat me to the floor to withdraw their earmark before it was challenged. And then the corruption and the bridge to nowhere and all that came, and it became less attractive. But it was a several-year process. But in the end, the House and the Senate and both parties agreed to an earmark ban. And that, for the role I played there, I think that's my proudest moment.
Well, let me ask you as a follow-up, because you know that people in the Speaker's office, whether Ryan or Boehner or whoever, say those earmarks helped us keep those unruly, wild brigands of the Freedom Caucus and the rest, help keep them in line, and without those carrots and with barely any sticks, we were at their mercy.
I know all those arguments.
Yeah.
I don't believe them. If you take the absolute apex, the worst year for earmarking, 2005, there were some 16,000 earmarks spread across all the appropriation bills, worth more than $30 billion, mostly transportation earmarks, but a lot of other ones too. During that year, we passed about 3 appropriation bills. No more productive than we've been in other times. So if that's what it takes to grease the skids to get things done, and I'm not saying that you can't buy a vote here or there, you can, but this notion that we need to bring back that corrupt practice, and it had become so corrupt. And what was done legally in exchange for campaign contributions was as offensive as what was done for money under the table that a few of members of Congress went to jail for. So no, that's not a practice we need to bring back.
So what is your most cringe-inducing moment? What do you hate thinking about? Tell us all.
Well, I mentioned the book I wrote last year about one vote I really regret. In the House, we were in charge of Republicans most of the time that I was there, and the financial crisis came, a big one, an ugly one. I think it's easy to forget how bad that was. Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary, and Ben Bernanke, came to the Capitol and said, here's what you have to do to avoid calamity, this TARP program, basically bailing out the banks. And that was offensive, especially to a small government guy, a conservative like me. But we were where we were. And I justified a vote against it because there were enough votes for it that I knew it would pass. And it was a cowardly thing to do on my part.
Because you thought it was the right thing.
I knew that it had to be done. And if you saw at that time, you had Barack Obama and John McCain campaigning for president. And it's tough to see this kind of thing happening today, where both of them set aside their campaigns, came back to Washington, and called their colleagues saying, please vote for this. Republican and a Democrat, instead of trying to use it as a political cudgel to beat the other one with, they said this needs to be done for the good of the country. And the first one failed in the House. Stock market dropped to 700 points or so, and then it came back and passed, but without my support. And like I said, I knew it wasn't something good, and I was certainly consistent with my philosophy to vote against it for free markets. But it needed to be done, and I let others carry my water for me. And that, when I think back, I think I shouldn't have done that.
You said in an interview with me a year ago that you think Trumpism is a fever in your party, and eventually it will break.
Yeah.
What if it doesn't?
It's a long fever, I can tell you that. It's tough. All of the incentives are pushing us further apart and make Trumpism, which is basically divide and conquer, easier. Whether it's fragmentation of media and social media, it all drives us apart. And Just take, for example, on the Kavanaugh thing, but it can be on just about any issue. There is no currency, there's no market there for trying to be thoughtful on something like this. To actually go in a hearing with Dr. Ford and Brett Kavanaugh and say, I'm going to actually see what comes out in this hearing, instead of announcing before what you're going to do. Because if you say, I'm going to wait until the hearing is done, then boy, you're pilloried from both sides. And there's just, on gun issues, for example, as well, there's no currency for saying, hey, universal background checks could be done if we do this, or no fly, no buy, that makes sense. It's just no, it's all one or all the other. And then at least you aren't pilloried on both sides. And politics is much about nuance. Barry Goldwater, one of my heroes, was always known for the extremism in defense of liberty and as a hardliner. But he also said, politics is nothing more than public business. Sometimes you make the best of a mixed bargain. And that's been lost. And few politicians want to talk about that. Few want to admit that after a hearing like we had on the Kavanaugh thing, that you walk out of that hearing with as much doubt as certainty. I did. And there's no currency for that anymore. There's no market for that. And there has to be. But the reason I think it is a fever that will pass is that we have no choice. There are huge issues coming up that we have to solve, and they have to be solved with both parties. Our looming debt and deficit. We are, within a couple of years, if interest rates continue to tick up as they are now, within just a few years, virtually all of our discretionary budget will be used simply to service the debt. We won't have any for defense, or education, anything. And that has to be solved with both parties.
Because the deficit's up 17%, despite one-party control of the House, Senate, and White House. Did Republicans, with maybe a few exceptions, but did Republicans never mean anything that they were saying about the deficit? You can go back and look at comments that Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan made when the deficit was smaller than it is today, going after Obama.
Right. Yeah, we haven't meant what we said, by and large. It's when you look at the budgets that we've passed, you can have tax cuts if you have commensurate budget cuts of some type. I am a supply sider to some extent. You cut some taxes like the corporate rate and you will get benefits, but bringing the individual rate from 39 to 36 isn't going to generate much. There's not stimulative effect there. So, but this is again the I'm here or I'm there. It's tougher for people to admit there is a balance here somewhere. We've lost that.
Yeah. I only have 1 minute left, so I do want to ask you this one question, which is, what's next for you? What are you going to do? You're still, there are people in the Senate that you think they're retiring like they're going to go right to the home. But
thank you for that.
But you are not. You are not that. Is my point. You are not that.
I was hoping you'd say that.
You got decades of productive life ahead of you. What are you going to do?
Well, I like I said, I'm not leaving the Senate because I don't like politics. I simply could not run a race that I would be proud of, and I could not stick to principles that I have and win in a Republican primary right now. It's just not in the cards. But I do plan to speak out and continue to use whatever platform or venue I have to talk about the need to come together, the need to find common ground. We have to do that. We have to do that. We have no choice. The big issues that we need to solve involve both parties. It has to be both parties, as we have in the past, agreeing to hold hands and jump on some of these issues, because one party, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, when they control everything, will not take the political risk. You have to share the risk. And so I'm going to try in whatever way I can to to push for that, to push for common ground.
Is it possible that that could mean running for president, possibly on a ticket with a Democrat?
Now, every senator thinks that they're going to run. This one less so, but I have said, I'm on record saying that I hope that somebody runs in the primary against the president. I think Republicans need to be reminded what it means to be conservative, a traditional conservative, believing in limited government economics, or free economics and free trade, and more than anything, to be decent, to not believe that your political opponent is your enemy. And I hope that Republicans are reminded by somebody of that. But I'm not planning on it.
Senator Jeff Flake, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Got this one.